Imagine a night so cold that your breath freezes in the air before it even hits the ground. The snow crunches under your boots. The wind cuts through every layer of clothing, turning fingers and toes numb. It is 1942, and a group of German soldiers huddles in a frozen trench outside Rostov. Their rifles rest on their shoulders, and their eyes scan the dark horizon. The sun has long disappeared, leaving the world in a deep, bone-chilling black. Suddenly, a strange sound slices through the night. It is not the roar of engines or the whistle of artillery. No, this is different. It is a high-pitched whistling like a straw broom scraping across a wooden floor. The soldiers freeze. Then one of them screams. Another raises his rifle, but his hands are shaking so badly he can hardly aim. The sound grows louder, closer, and more terrifying. Hexa! Hexa! Someone yells, but it is too late. In that frozen night, death feels closer than ever. The soldiers speak in whispers, trying to make sense of what they have heard. Some call it a ghost. Others mutter about witches. Rumors fly through the trenches like wildfire. Every few nights the same sound returns. The Germans cannot see anyone. They see no planes, no lights, nothing. And yet, bombs fall from the sky, destroying tents, vehicles, and lives. But the truth is far stranger than any rumor. The ghosts are not spirits. They are not old men with evil powers. They are young girls. Some are barely 18 years old. They fly fragile planes that could be destroyed by a single bullet. There are no radios in their aircraft. No parachutes to save them if they are hit. No radar to warn them of danger. All they have is courage, skill, and a will that no enemy has ever faced. Among these girls is Marina Raskova, a legend already before the war truly begins. She is strong, fearless, and determined to fight the German invaders. She has survived harsh journeys across Siberia and has inspired thousands of young girls through letters that scream, "Give us planes. Let us fight. Let us kill the enemy." These are not ordinary girls who want to bake bread or sew bandages. They want to take to the skies and protect their country. The Soviet leadership could have ignored them, laughed at them, or told them to wait. But desperation is a powerful force. The German army is advancing like a wall of steel. They crush everything in their path. The Soviet Air Force has lost planes, pilots, and hope. And so Marina's call is answered. The order comes down: form female air regiments. Train them. Send them to fight. Among these regiments, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment will become the most feared. The Germans have no idea what is coming. They do not know that the little sisters, the men scoff at, the girls they think of as weak and inexperienced, are about to terrorize their nights. The planes are slow, fragile, made of wood and canvas. One pilot, Nadesha Popova, whispers to herself when she first sees her aircraft, "It's a coffin with wings." Yet, these girls will take that coffin and turn it into a weapon that the enemy cannot see coming. The first night flight is simple to describe but almost impossible to imagine. 3 planes, 6 girls, lift off into the darkness. There are no lights on the runway. Just 2 girls at the end holding lanterns, guiding their comrades. The engines of their tiny planes sound more like sewing machines than war machines. And as they climb into the black sky, they become invisible hunters, shadows moving silently across the battlefield. Below them, German soldiers stare at the empty darkness. They hear the wind whistling, their hearts racing. They grip their rifles, trembling. The air smells of fear. They whisper to each other, "Ghosts, witches." But the truth is even stranger than their imagination. It is not ghosts in the sky. It is girls. Girls with bravery that outmatches the mightiest fighter planes. Girls who will haunt the Germans' nights for years to come. By the end of that first night, the Germans have experienced only a glimpse of what is coming. They do not know names like Popova or Raskova yet. They do not know about the tactics, the silent glides, or the courage that defies death. All they feel is terror, a terror so deep that some cannot sleep. Every rustle in the trees, every gust of wind becomes a warning. The night witches are coming and they are unstoppable. As the dawn breaks over the frozen fields near Rostov, the soldiers in the trenches feel relief but not safety. They have survived the night, but the echoes of whistling planes linger in their minds. They glance at the sky, half expecting to see those girls again. And one thought grips them. The Germans thought ghosts haunted them, but the truth is far more terrifying. The night witches have arrived. And the war will never be the same. The winter wind cut through the Soviet airfield like a blade. Snow drifted across the frozen ground, and the girls of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment arrived for training, trembling in boots far too big for their feet. The male instructors laughed openly at them. They called them little sisters, mocking their youth and inexperience. Some gave them hand-me-down uniforms from men twice their size. The girls stuffed the oversized boots with rags so they would stay on. Their long hair was cut short. Their names were replaced with numbers. But no mockery, no humiliation could break their spirits. These girls were soldiers now, and the war would teach them lessons the instructors could never imagine. Their planes were waiting, the Polikarpov P-2. To anyone else it looked fragile like a toy. 2 wings, a canvas body stretched over wooden frames, and a tiny 100 horsepower engine. The Germans could destroy it with a single bullet. No radios. No radar. No parachutes. One pilot, Nadesha Popova, looked at the plane and whispered, "It's a coffin with wings." Yet that coffin would become the most feared weapon in the sky. The training was brutal. 6 months of learning what usually took 3 years. Navigation, bombing, flight theory, and survival in freezing conditions. They studied for 14 hours a day, slept in unheated barracks, and practiced landing on dirt strips in total darkness. Too low. Pull up, a trainer shouted during a night landing. "I can't see the ground," one girl yelled back. They learned to feel the air beneath them, to sense the wind, to trust their instincts when nothing else could guide them. One night, a young recruit named Galina Belova stumbled on the icy runway. She fell face first into the snow, her hands numb from the cold. "Get up. We fly again," barked the sergeant. Galina scrambled, shaking and bleeding, but she rose and climbed into her plane. She would fly that night and many nights after because the war did not wait for anyone to be ready. The first mission came quietly, like the whisper of death itself. The target, a German headquarters near the Don River. 3 planes, 6 girls took off under the cover of darkness. No runway lights. Just the small lanterns held by 2 brave girls at the edge of the strip. The engines chugged softly like sewing machines, barely loud enough to hear over the pounding of hearts. As the planes rose, the night swallowed them. Below, German soldiers waited, unaware that what they feared most would not be a fighter, not a bomber, but a slow wooden biplane piloted by girls. The planes hugged the ground, skimming forests and rivers to avoid radar. The whistling of the wind over the wings was the only sound. It was a sound that would soon terrify an entire army. "Stay steady," whispered Popova to her navigator. Her hands gripped the controls, numb from cold but steady in determination. They reached the target. Searchlights cut across the dark sky, fingers of white light reaching for them like hungry ghosts. Flak burst all around, metal exploding in deadly clouds. But the girls had a secret, the ghost glide. They cut their engines. Silence replaced the chug of the motor. The wind whistled through the wires and canvas. They became invisible hunters, sliding like shadows across the battlefield. Below, German soldiers froze, staring into the night. They could see nothing, hear nothing, but somehow the enemy was there. Boom. A bomb dropped from the wing, exploding in the enemy camp. Chaos. Panic. Terror. By the time the planes returned to the field, their hearts were hammering. They had survived their first mission. They had faced fire, darkness, and death itself, and they had returned. The men on the ground, who had mocked them for weeks, stared in disbelief. These girls, the little sisters, had struck terror into the hearts of the most feared army in the world. But survival came at a cost. One plane returned with holes in the wings, another with a shredded map. The girls landed and climbed out, freezing, exhausted, and yet unbroken. They were a new kind of soldier, trained in courage, sharpened by fear, and driven by a need to protect their country. And even though the night had passed, the war had not. Every mission would be more dangerous than the last. The instructors began to realize that these girls were unlike anyone they had trained before. They could fly in temperatures that would paralyze most men. They could navigate without instruments, read the land below in darkness, and deliver bombs with deadly accuracy. Every night, they learned more about the enemy than the enemy could ever learn about them. In the barracks, letters from home reminded them why they flew. Girls wrote of fathers, brothers, and friends lost in the war. They wrote of homes destroyed, of dreams stolen. But they also wrote of courage and of a growing legend, the Night Witches. By the time winter turned to spring, German soldiers had already begun whispering stories about the witches who flew in the night. Some swore they had seen ghosts. Others refused to light a fire or even smoke a cigarette for fear of revealing themselves. The Night Witches were becoming more than pilots. They were phantoms, a terror that could not be touched, a legend that grew with every mission. And yet, even as the girls mastered the skies, danger waited for them at every turn. The German army would not ignore them forever. New tactics, new weapons, new hunters would soon challenge the Night Witches. But for now, in the dark, frozen night over Rostov, one thing was clear: the girls of the 588th had arrived, and the world would never see war in the same way again. The winter night was alive with whispers. German soldiers in the trenches called it a ghost. Others swore it was witches flying above. But the girls of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment knew the truth. They were neither ghosts nor witches. They were pilots, young, brave, and fearless. Their planes were fragile, slow, and made of wood and canvas, but they carried a weapon far deadlier than any machine: the element of surprise. The Germans thought they had prepared for everything. They had radar, searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, and elite pilots. But the Night Witches had discovered a secret that would make the enemy tremble. They called it the Ghost Glide. Normally, pilots roar toward their targets, engines screaming, leaving no doubt about their presence. But the Night Witches did something impossible. As they approached German positions, they would cut their engines completely. The planes would glide silently through the night, the canvas wings rattling softly in the cold wind. No engine. No sound. Just the whistling of air through the wires. To the soldiers below, it sounded like a broomstick gliding through the darkness. And that sound became a nightmare they could not escape. "Do you hear it?" a German soldier whispered, clutching his rifle. "It's coming, the witches." They could not see them. They could not hear them. And yet the bombs always fell. Their camps burned. Their hearts raced with every passing shadow, every gust of wind. No one could sleep. No one could light a fire. No one could even smoke a cigarette without fear of revealing themselves. The Night Witches flew low, hugging the ground, dodging searchlights, and dropping their bombs by hand. They had no parachutes. If the plane was hit, there was no escape. Yet they continued night after night. Every mission was a dance with death, every return a miracle. Nadezhda Popova, one of the most skilled pilots, became a legend in her own right. She would glide silently toward her target, calculating wind, distance, and enemy positions in complete darkness. One misstep, one miscalculation, and both she and her navigator could be gone forever. But she never hesitated. "Trust the air," she whispered to herself. "Trust the wind. Trust the night." Meanwhile, the Germans became increasingly desperate. They deployed flak traps, lined up searchlights, and even offered the Iron Cross, their highest honor, to any pilot who could shoot down a P-2. But the witches were smarter. They studied their enemy, memorized flight patterns, and learned to use the darkness as a shield. When searchlights caught two planes, a third plane would glide silently past and drop bombs directly on the German guns. The hunters became the hunted. It was not just strategy that made the Night Witches terrifying. It was psychological warfare. Soldiers began seeing shadows in the trees, hearing whistling in the wind, and imagining bombs falling from nowhere. One officer wrote in his diary, "We cannot sleep. Every rustle of leaves, every movement of the wind makes us reach for our rifles. They are everywhere yet nowhere. Ghosts? No, worse than ghosts. Girls, flying ghosts." The psychological toll was devastating. Men shook with fear, refusing to eat, to move, or to even breathe loudly. Every night, the whistling returned. Every night, the terror returned. The Germans began to fear the dark itself. On one mission near the southern front, 3 planes glided silently into enemy territory. Below, German soldiers watched, frozen. Then, without warning, the bombs fell. Flames erupted, tents burned, equipment destroyed. The soldiers scrambled, firing blindly into the sky. The P-2s turned back, engines still off, disappearing into the darkness like shadows melting into the night. Even when planes were hit, the girls never gave up. Engines sputtered, wings were shredded by bullets, maps were torn. Yet they returned, hearts pounding, hands frozen, faces pale, but spirits unbroken. "Another plane," Popova said after one mission. "We are not finished." And the witches took to the skies again. Night after night, they honed their skills, perfected the glide, and became a living nightmare for the Germans. The ground crews were part of the terror too. All women, they worked tirelessly in freezing temperatures, loading bombs, cranking engines by hand, repairing planes in the open snow. One mechanic, her fingers frozen to the wrench, muttered, "I can't feel my fingers," but continued anyway. Without them, the witches had no wings. By the end of the first winter, the legend of the Night Witches had spread. Soldiers whispered of witches who could appear out of nowhere, strike with deadly precision, and vanish without a trace. Entire units refused to move at night. They stopped using vehicles. They hid in the shadows, terrified that a wooden plane could drop death from above. And yet, for the girls, it was only the beginning. The Germans were learning. They were building traps, deploying faster planes, and preparing to hunt the witches themselves. The element of surprise, once a shield, would soon be tested against a new, even deadlier threat. But for now the night witches ruled the night. They had transformed fear into their weapon, silence into power, and fragility into legend. The Germans had no idea what they were up against, and every night, that ignorance would cost them dearly. The whistling in the night was no longer a sound. It was a promise, a warning, a nightmare. And the girls who flew those fragile planes had already shown that courage, cunning, and determination could make the weakest-looking aircraft the most feared in the world. The night was theirs. And soon the Germans would learn that the witches were not just hunters. They were shadows of death, unstoppable, invisible, and always above. The winter nights had grown darker, colder, and deadlier. The night witches had mastered the skies, but every mission carried the taste of fire and the shadow of death. German forces had grown wary. They were no longer content to wait helplessly for shadows to pass over their camps. Searchlights crisscrossed the sky, flak bursts exploded like deadly fireworks, and fighter planes patrolled relentlessly. For the girls of the 588th, the sky was no longer empty space. It was a battlefield filled with traps designed to destroy them. On one night near the southern front, several planes lifted off for a routine bombing mission. Their engines hummed softly, their wooden frames creaking under the frozen weight of bombs. The air smelled sharp and bitter with frost. Below them, German soldiers waited, eyes strained, rifles ready, flak cannons primed. Then the first fire erupted. A tracer round from a German machine gun hit one of the P-2 planes. Flames licked at the canvas wings. The navigator screamed. Popova in the cockpit felt the heat through her gloves. Her plane wobbled dangerously, but she held steady, guiding the flaming coffin toward the target. She dropped her bombs by hand. Boom. The German camp erupted in chaos. Soldiers ran blindly through the snow, rifles firing at shadows. Other planes were not so lucky. Engines were struck. Wings shredded. One plane caught fire completely, a falling star in the night sky. There was no parachute, no escape. The pilot and her navigator disappeared into the darkness, leaving only fire and silence behind. The witches below saw their friends vanish and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Yet, despite the terror, the survivors did not falter. They landed, hearts pounding, faces pale from the cold and adrenaline. Ground crews, all women, ran to the planes in the snow, hands frozen to the metal, faces red from the wind. They cranked engines by hand, loaded bombs, and sent the girls back into the night again. There was no time to grieve. There was no time to hesitate. Every second counted. Every mission could be the last. One mechanic, her fingers frostbitten, whispered, "I can't feel them." The sergeant barked, "Then stop feeling and start turning. The planes must fly again." And they did. Through the snow, through the cold, through the pain they worked. Each girl became the heartbeat of the regiment, keeping the wooden planes alive, keeping the fear alive, keeping the legend alive. Even the most experienced pilots faced moments that tested them like never before. Nadezhda Popova, returning from a mission with her plane riddled with bullet holes, climbed out of the cockpit, blood mixing with oil and frost on her face. She looked at the wrecked wings and said softly, "Get me another plane. I am not finished." And the next night she flew again. 18 missions in a single night were not unheard of for the night witches. They landed, refueled, reloaded, and soared again, their endurance almost inhuman. The Germans began to realize that fear alone would not save them. They deployed concentrated flak batteries, searchlights, and fighter planes specifically to hunt these women. But the witches were clever. They used the darkness, the wind, and the snow as their allies. They flew in teams, with decoy planes drawing fire while others slipped silently through the shadows. Every time the Germans thought they had a plan, the girls found a way to turn it against them. But the cost of this legend was written in blood. By the end of the first winter, the regiment had lost several girls. Empty bunks lined the barracks, silent reminders of courage and sacrifice. There were no funerals, no time for mourning. They collected the personal belongings of the fallen, letters from home, small mirrors, hidden trinkets, and placed them in a box. Then they went back to the airfield. Death was a companion, but it was not a reason to stop. For the soldiers on the ground, the night witches became more than a nuisance. They became a psychological weapon. Entire German units refused to move at night. They hid in foxholes, fearful of the whistling in the wind. They could not smoke, not even light a fire, for fear that a single spark would bring death from above. Every shadow became a threat. Every sound was a warning. The women had transformed fear itself into a weapon. Yet the girls themselves were human. They saw friends fall, planes burn, and comrades vanish into the darkness. Some could not sleep at night, haunted by visions of smoke, fire, and falling planes. Others developed night blindness from exhaustion, staring into the dark and seeing nothing but shadows. But even in the face of relentless danger, they persevered. The mission, the country, and the memory of their fallen sisters demanded it. By the time the snow began to melt, the night witches were no longer just a regiment. They were a force of nature. The Germans whispered about them in terror. "They are everywhere," one officer wrote. "Invisible, silent, deadly. Ghosts with wings. And yet, they are only girls." The first chapter of their story, filled with sacrifice, terror, and courage, had come to an end. But the war was far from over. New weapons, new hunters, and even deadlier missions awaited them. And still, the night witches would rise into the night, flying wooden coffins, carrying bombs, carrying fear, and carrying a legend that would never die. The girls looked up at the dark sky, their eyes reflecting the fires of the missions they had survived. "One more night," whispered Popova. "One more for those who cannot fly again." And the night answered with a whistle, a promise that the terror was far from over. By 1943 the war had shifted. The night witches had become a legend, striking fear into the hearts of German soldiers night after night. But now the hunters were learning. The Luftwaffe could no longer ignore the small, fragile planes that seemed to appear from nowhere. They brought in faster planes, better radar, and specialized night fighters designed to hunt the witches themselves. The sky was no longer safe. It was filled with danger from every angle. The girls of the 588th knew that each mission could be their last. Engines roared, searchlights cut through the darkness, and flak shells exploded like deadly fireworks around them. For the first time, the witches were not just striking fear, they were being hunted. Raisa Popova and her navigator, Katia Ryabova, prepared for another night mission. They checked their P-2, the slow wooden biplane that had become their home. Every scratch, every dent, every hole from previous missions reminded them of what they had survived, and what could still kill them. "Stay close," Katia whispered. "Tonight they are looking for us." The Germans had introduced a new threat, the Messerschmitt Bf-110, a fast, deadly plane with primitive radar and trained pilots who had studied the night witches for months. These pilots knew the patterns, the tactics, even the sound of the wooden biplanes. One mistake and the witches would be sitting ducks. The first mission of the night was routine: destroy a German fuel depot near the front lines. But as soon as the girls lifted off, the night changed. Searchlights sprang to life, cutting through the darkness. Tracer rounds streaked across the sky. The Germans had set a trap. Popova's heart pounded. She felt the cold bite of fear, but she did not hesitate. "Glide now," she ordered. Silent as always. They cut their engines. The wind whistled through the wires and the P-2 became a ghost in the night. Below, German soldiers squinted, straining to see. But the real threat came from above. One of the Bf-110s dived, its engine roaring like a predator closing in on prey. Popova and Katia's plane shuddered as bullets ripped through the canvas. One wing wobbled dangerously, but they held steady. "Don't move," Popova whispered. "Trust the night." The Germans fired, but the witches had a trick. They had studied their enemy's speed and turning radius. Popova pulled the stick sharply, the plane tilting at a nearly impossible angle. The German fighter overshot, crashing past them, unable to maneuver in the sudden glide. Katia opened fire with the small 7.62 mm machine gun, aiming at the engine of the pursuing fighter. Sparks flew. Smoke trailed from the enemy plane. The hunter became the hunted. It was a game of life and death, played high in the freezing night sky. Each mission tested their courage, skill, and endurance. Nadezhda Popova had once returned from a mission with 42 bullet holes in her plane. Her map was shredded. Her helmet was torn. She climbed out, shivering, blood mixing with oil, and said simply, "Get me another plane. I am not finished." That was the spirit of the night witches. Fearless, relentless, unstoppable. On the ground, their sisters in the regiment worked tirelessly. They hand-cranked engines, loaded bombs, repaired wings, and prepared for the next wave of attacks. Every second counted. They lived in mud, snow, and freezing temperatures. One mechanic, her fingers frozen, muttered, "I can't feel them," but continued anyway. The witches could not fly without them. The regiment was a sisterhood, each member vital to survival and victory. But the Germans were relentless. They adapted, deploying night hunters equipped with angled machine guns, searchlight zones, and radar. Entire sections of the sky became traps. Every shadow could hide a predator. The girls began to notice new sounds, the deeper roar of engines that did not falter. The Bf-110s were faster, stronger, and hungrier. One mistake meant death. One miscalculation could destroy years of courage in an instant. In one daring mission over Poland, Popova and Katia faced 4 enemy fighters at once. Engines spat oil and fire. Bullets tore through the canvas wings. Smoke filled the cockpit. They had 2 choices: jump and die or stay in the burning plane and fight. They stayed. They guided their flaming coffin toward the enemy searchlight batteries, dropping bombs with deadly accuracy. Darkness returned. Silence ruled. And the Germans were humiliated. The Night Witch's legend grew. German soldiers could not sleep. They could not light a fire. Every rustle, every whistle in the wind became a threat. Entire units hid in trenches, terrified of the whistling wooden biplanes. The girls had turned fear itself into a weapon. And yet, the danger was real, constant, and ever-growing. Through it all, the witches endured. Each mission left them exhausted, hands bleeding, faces frozen, but hearts unbroken. They had seen friends vanish into the night. They had felt the icy grip of death. And yet, every time they climbed into the cockpit, trusting the night, the wind, and each other. Their courage became a force stronger than metal, faster than bullets, and deadlier than fear. By 1943, the Night Witches were no longer just pilots. They were shadows, phantoms, legends. The Germans hunted them relentlessly, but the witches had learned to hunt back. Every glide, every bomb, every maneuver was a calculated strike. They had become unstoppable. And for the soldiers below, the whistling in the night was no longer just a sound. It was a warning. The hunters had become the hunted. And the witches would not stop until every German soldier who feared them had learned the cost of underestimating a girl with a wooden plane. April 1945. The war was reaching its terrible climax. Berlin burned under the Soviet advance, the city shattered by months of bombing, shelling, and bloodshed. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment prepared for what could be their most dangerous mission yet. The German army, cornered and desperate, had laid every trap, set every hunter, and lined the skies with fire. The girls of the Night Witches climbed into their wooden P-2 planes. Frost covered the wings, their hands trembled from the cold, and their hearts pounded in unison with the engines. "Stay close," whispered Nadezhda Popova to her navigator. "Tonight, the night is ours, but the danger is greater than ever." The German forces had introduced their deadliest hunter yet, a pilot who had dedicated himself to wiping out the Night Witches. He knew their patterns, their tricks, even their silence. His plane, stripped down for speed, was a predator hunting shadows. He had trained his eyes to see the faintest glimmer of P-2 exhaust in the darkness. One mistake from the witches and it would be their last. As they lifted into the night sky, the glow of Berlin's fires painted the horizon red. The city below was a jagged, burning landscape. Engines roared, searchlights sliced through the darkness, and flak exploded around them like deadly stars. Each plane climbed, tilted, and maneuvered, relying on skill, courage, and trust in each other. The first pass was chaos. 4 planes were immediately under fire. One caught in a cross of searchlights, another hit by tracer rounds. Popova's plane shuddered as bullets tore through the canvas wings. Smoke filled the cockpit. Her navigator, Katia Ryabova, gripped the controls, her knuckles white from cold and fear. Flames licked at the wood. "Don't jump," Popova shouted. "We fight." There was no time for hesitation. The witches had trained for moments like this, where survival depended on courage, skill, and a single, precise decision. They aimed their bombs by hand, targeting German artillery and searchlight batteries. Boom! The enemy position erupted in fire. Darkness returned. The hunters had been hit. The hunted had survived. Even in the face of near-certain death, the girls continued their mission. One P-2, riddled with holes and smoke pouring from the engine, glided silently toward a German communications hub. Below, soldiers froze in terror, unsure where the attack would come from next. The girls had mastered the sky, turning fragility into advantage, fear into weapon. But victory came at a heavy cost. Several planes did not return. Friends vanished into the night, swallowed by fire, flak, or the frozen sky. The barracks were emptier than before, the silence heavier. Each loss was felt deeply. But the mission was never about survival alone. It was about duty, courage, and the fight for a country under siege. The living carried the memory of the fallen, and the dead inspired every drop of courage in the sky. As they approached the heart of Berlin, the stakes could not have been higher. The German hunter who had studied them for years dived at Popova's plane, engine roaring, guns blazing. Popova tilted the P-2 sharply, the wings creaking under pressure. The hunter overshot. Katia fired the machine gun, hitting the engine. Sparks flew. Smoke trailed across the night sky. The predator had failed. Once again the hunter had become the hunted. By the morning of May 2, 1945, the guns were finally silent. Berlin had fallen. The war in Europe was over. The girls of the 588th, exhausted, frostbitten, and forever changed, gathered together. They were no longer just pilots. They were legends, survivors of more than 30,000 missions, the deliverers of 23,000 tons of bombs, the nightmares of the Luftwaffe. Yet even in victory the world did not fully honor them. At the victory parade in Moscow, the 588th was not allowed to march. Their wooden planes were too slow, their bravery overshadowed by new jets and heavy tanks. The leadership wanted a display of power, not courage. They told the girls to go home, to put away their medals, and to vanish quietly into history. But legends cannot be hidden. The Night Witches kept their legacy alive. Every year on May 8, the survivors met in a small park in Moscow. They brought flowers, drank tea, and shared memories of nights spent in the sky, of friends lost, of bombs dropped with precision, and of the terror they had inflicted on the enemy. Nadezhda Popova lived to be 91. Before she died, she said, "Sometimes when the wind blows just right at night, I can still hear the wires whistling." The story of the Night Witches teaches the world a lesson that endures. Courage does not depend on strength, size, or power. It depends on the will to act when everyone else hides, the ability to face fear when it is deafening, and the determination to fight even when death is waiting in the shadows. The girls who flew fragile wooden planes into flak-filled skies were not just pilots. They were proof that heroism often wears an unexpected face. They were proof that those who are underestimated can change the course of history. They were proof that even in the darkest night, shadows can become legends, and fear itself can be turned into victory. And though the planes no longer fly and the guns have long since fallen silent, the whistling in the night, the sound of courage, sacrifice, and defiance, still echoes. The Night Witches may be gone, but their story, their legend, and their lesson remain, a permanent mark on history. The winter wind cut through the Soviet airfield like a blade. Snow drifted across the frozen ground, and the girls of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment arrived for training, trembling in boots far too big for their feet. The male instructors laughed openly at them. They called them little sisters, mocking their youth and inexperience. Some gave them hand-me-down uniforms from men twice their size. The girls stuffed the oversized boots with rags so they would stay on. Their long hair was cut short. Their names were replaced with numbers. But no mockery, no humiliation could break their spirits. These girls were soldiers now, and the war would teach them lessons the instructors could never imagine. Their planes were waiting, the Polikarpov P-2. To anyone else it looked fragile, like a toy. 2 wings, a canvas body stretched over wooden frames, and a tiny 100 horsepower engine. The Germans could destroy it with a single bullet. No radios. No radar. No parachutes. One pilot, Nadezhda Popova, looked at the plane and whispered, "It's a coffin with wings." Yet that coffin would become the most feared weapon in the sky. The training was brutal. 6 months of learning what usually took 3 years. Navigation, bombing, flight theory, and survival in freezing conditions. They studied for 14 hours a day, slept in unheated barracks, and practiced landing on dirt strips in total darkness. Too low. "Pull up," a trainer shouted during a night landing. "I can't see the ground," one girl yelled back. They learned to feel the air beneath them, to sense the wind, to trust their instincts when nothing else could guide them. One night, a young recruit named Galina Belova stumbled on the icy runway. She fell face first into the snow, her hands numb from the cold. "Get up. We fly again," barked the sergeant. Galina scrambled, shaking and bleeding, but she rose and climbed into her plane. She would fly that night and many nights after because the war did not wait for anyone to be ready. The first mission came quietly, like the whisper of death itself. The target, a German headquarters near the Don River. 3 planes, 6 girls took off under the cover of darkness. No runway lights. Just the small lanterns held by 2 brave girls at the edge of the strip. The engines chugged softly like sewing machines, barely loud enough to hear over the pounding of hearts. As the planes rose, the night swallowed them. Below, German soldiers waited, unaware that what they feared most would not be a fighter, not a bomber, but a slow wooden biplane piloted by girls. The planes hugged the ground, skimming forests and rivers to avoid radar. The whistling of the wind over the wings was the only sound. It was a sound that would soon terrify an entire army. "Stay steady," whispered Popova to her navigator. Her hands gripped the controls, numb from cold but steady in determination. They reached the target. Searchlights cut across the dark sky, fingers of white light reaching for them like hungry ghosts. Flak burst all around, metal exploding in deadly clouds. But the girls had a secret, the Ghost Glide. They cut their engines. Silence replaced the chug of the motor. The wind whistled through the wires and canvas. They became invisible hunters, sliding like shadows across the battlefield. Below, German soldiers froze, staring into the night. They could see nothing, hear nothing, but somehow the enemy was there. Boom. A bomb dropped from the wing, exploding in the enemy camp. Chaos. Panic. Terror. By the time the planes returned to the field, their hearts were hammering. They had survived their first mission. They had faced fire, darkness, and death itself, and they had returned. The men on the ground, who had mocked them for weeks, stared in disbelief. These girls, the little sisters, had struck terror into the hearts of the most feared army in the world. But survival came at a cost. One plane returned with holes in the wings, another with a shredded map. The girls landed and climbed out, freezing, exhausted, and yet unbroken. They were a new kind of soldier, trained in courage, sharpened by fear, and driven by a need to protect their country. And even though the night had passed, the war had not. Every mission would be more dangerous than the last. The instructors began to realize that these girls were unlike anyone they had trained before. They could fly in temperatures that would paralyze most men. They could navigate without instruments, read the land below in darkness, and deliver bombs with deadly accuracy. Every night, they learned more about the enemy than the enemy could ever learn about them. In the barracks, letters from home reminded them why they flew. Girls wrote of fathers, brothers, and friends lost in the war. They wrote of homes destroyed, of dreams stolen. But they also wrote of courage and of a growing legend, the Night Witches. By the time winter turned to spring, German soldiers had already begun whispering stories about the witches who flew in the night. Some swore they had seen ghosts. Others refused to light a fire or even smoke a cigarette for fear of revealing themselves. The Night Witches were becoming more than pilots. They were phantoms, a terror that could not be touched, a legend that grew with every mission. And yet, even as the girls mastered the skies, danger waited for them at every turn. The German army would not ignore them forever. New tactics, new weapons, new hunters would soon challenge the Night Witches. But for now, in the dark, frozen night over Rostov, one thing was clear: the girls of the 588th had arrived. And the world would never see war in the same way again.